Iran after World War II. After the end of the Second World War, the struggle between democratic and reactionary forces in Iran intensified even more. The defeat of fascist Germany and imperialist Japan, and the victory of the Soviet Union served as a powerful new impetus for the development of the democratic movement in Iran, which rose to a new level. At the same time, the interference of the Anglo-American imperialists in the internal affairs of the country, and their assistance to the Iranian reaction in the struggle against democratic organizations intensified to an even greater extent. The mass terror of the police, the gendarmerie, and the armed forces of the reactionary Khans against the peasant unions, the People's Party, workers and other organizations and their leaders spread throughout the country. The reactionary Khans and the gendarmerie were especially outrageous in Iranian Azerbaijan. Here, the feudal oppression and arbitrariness of the administration and the gendarmerie were aggravated by national oppression. Iranian Azerbaijan is inhabited by a people completely different from the Persians, Azerbaijanis, who have their own language, their own traditions, and national characteristics. The Persian language in Iranian Azerbaijan is spoken only by a limited number of officials sent from Tehran, and a narrow circle of landlords and intellectuals. But contrary to the indisputable reality, the Iranian ruling circles did not even recognize the existence of the Azerbaijani language. Some of their representatives stated that it was a dialect of the Persian language. Others even demanded that the Azerbaijanis forget their language, which, they say, was imposed on them by foreign conquerors. Continuing the chauvinistic traditions of Reza Shah, reactionary Iranian circles claimed that there were no other nationalities in Iran except Iranians, and that Azerbaijanis, Kurds, Turkmens and other nationalities were Iranians and had no right to raise the question of their culture, language, etc. This chauvinistic policies led to clearly ugly phenomena. In Iranian Azerbaijan, for example, in courts where Persian was the obligatory language, the investigation and interrogation had to be conducted in Azerbaijani. Because the population does not speak another language, and all records were made in Persian. All textbooks and books for schools were published in Persian, although the children did not speak Persian. The population of Iranian Azerbaijan was deprived of the most elementary democratic right to use their native language. The entire supreme administration of the province consisted of non-Azerbaijanis. The economic and political backwardness of Iranian Azerbaijan, and the oppression and lack of rights of Iranian Azerbaijanis were especially vivid when compared with the Azerbaijani Soviet Republic, inhabited by the same people, where socialist industry and agriculture flourish. The material and everyday situation of the people is at a height unattainable for Iranian Azerbaijanis. An unprecedented development has received national in form and socialist in content. The culture of the Azerbaijani people, and where Azerbaijanis enjoy all political rights and opportunities for their economic, political, social and cultural development. Azerbaijanis have always been distinguished by their activity in the democratic movement of Iran. In recent years, they have also been in the forefront of the fighters against reaction. Their demands put forward at mass rallies in 1945, for the convening of constitutionally provided provincial and regional endowments, for the purge of fascist elements from the state apparatus. The police and the gendarmerie, for the provocateur Sayedzia to be brought to trial, for the granting of democratic freedoms, were supported by the population and other regions of Iran. But the reactionary clique in power in Tehran did not in the least want to reckon with the will and interests of the population, and in particular the Azerbaijanis. In the spring of 1944, the reactionary majority of the Iranian Majlis defiantly refused to approve the mandate of the prominent Azerbaijani democratic figure Pishavari. who received the largest number of votes from Tabriz in the elections. This defiant decision of the Majlis against Azerbaijanis was protested not only by Azerbaijanis, but also by wide circles of the Tehran public. A protest against this decision was signed by the editors of 60 Tehran newspapers. In 1945, the Ministry of Internal Affairs refused to approve the composition of the members of the Tabriz City Council, because democratic candidates turned out to be elected. Despite the fact that the elections were held on the basis of the reactionary Reza Shah law. The reactionary ruling clique treated the Azerbaijanis and their demands with disdain, bordering on mockery. Known for his reactionary activities during the revolution of 1905 to 1911, Iranian Prime Minister Sadr, when discussing the demands of the Azerbaijanis received by telegraph at the meeting of the majority of the Majlis on August 15, 1945, stated, "I do not attach any importance to these telegrams. In the summer of 1945, the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan was formed in Iranian Azerbaijan, which included representatives of all sections of the population. The leading force of the movement, despite its small numbers, was the working class. In early September, the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan published an appeal, in which it put forward a demand for Iranian Azerbaijan to be granted autonomy in the field of culture and local government within Iran. The introduction of the Azerbaijani language into official use, the formation of regional and provincial endowments, and a number of other requirements. The Democratic Party of Azerbaijan and its demands were very popular among the population of Iranian Azerbaijan. In October 1945, the Organization of the People's Party of Azerbaijan, which by that time had more than 40,000 members, joined its ranks in full force. In a short time, the Azerbaijan Democratic Party turned into a mass national democratic party, uniting the leading representatives of various segments of the population of Iranian Azerbaijan. As the Azerbaijan newspaper published in Tabriz reported on January 23, 1946, at the end of 1945 there were already 70,000 members in the Azerbaijan Democratic Party, of which 6,000 were workers, 56,000 peasants, and 2,000 intelligentsia. Handicraftsmen and artisans, 3,000, merchants, 2,000, landowners, 500 and clergy, 100. The large feudal khans, who saw the growth of the democratic movement as a threat to their domination and privileges, tried with the help of the gendarmerie and the police to prevent the growth of authority by repression and terror and popularity of the Democratic Party. The gendarmerie and the armed gangs organized by the reactionary khans attacked active participants in the democratic movement, beat them with whips, threw them into prison, branded them with red-hot iron, and killed them. Against the peasants who dared to complain about the arbitrariness of the khans and the gendarmerie, the authorities fabricated false accusations of violating the order, banditry, and then sent them to prison. In October 1945 alone, the reactionary khans, the police and the gendarmerie killed about 100 in Azerbaijan, and threw more than 1,000 members of the democratic movement into prison. In response to this rampant Black Hundred terror, the peasants began to create self-defense detachments in Azerbaijan, which were called Fidai detachments. The reaction failed by its repressions to stop the growth of the democratic movement in Iranian Azerbaijan. In November, crowded rallies and meetings were held in all cities and regions of Azerbaijan, at which delegates were elected to the All-People's Assembly of Iranian Azerbaijan. On November 20 and 21, 1945, meetings of the National Assembly were held in Tabriz, in which 744 delegates from all regions of Iranian Azerbaijan participated. The National Assembly unanimously adopted a declaration addressed to the Shah, the chairman of the Majlis and the Prime Minister of Iran, in which a demand was made for granting Iranian Azerbaijan national autonomy within the Iranian state. The declaration announced the intention of the Azerbaijani people to create their own national government to manage their internal affairs, their own national majlis, and translate all state records management, as well as teaching in schools, into the Azerbaijani language. Having declared itself the founding Congress, the National Assembly of Azerbaijan elected a national committee of 39 people, entrusting it with managing the internal affairs of Azerbaijan, organizing elections to the National Majlis, and negotiating with the relevant government circles in order to peacefully resolve the issue of granting Azerbaijan national autonomy. After that, elections to the Majlis of Iranian Azerbaijan were held on the basis of universal, direct, equal suffrage by secret ballot. For the first time in Iranian history, women also took part in the elections. 101 deputies were elected to the Majlis. The elected representatives represented all sections of the Azerbaijani population. On December 12, 1945, sessions of the National Majlis of Iranian Azerbaijan opened. On behalf of the Majlis, the organizer of the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan, Said Jafar Pishavari, formed the national government of Iranian Azerbaijan. On December 12, 1945, the Majlis approved the government's program, which included strengthening the autonomy of Azerbaijan, the election of the Anjuman, the reorganization of the Fidei detachments into a people's militia, introduction of the Azerbaijani language as an official language, compulsory free education of all children of school age in their native language, creation of a national university, the development of industry and trade, the opening of new factories, the adoption of a labor law and a law regulating relations between peasants and landowners, the division between the peasants of the state lands and the lands of the reactionary landowners who fled from Azerbaijan and carried out propaganda against the autonomy of Azerbaijan, freedom of conscience and religion for all citizens, as well as the equality of rights and obligations of Azerbaijanis, Kurds, Armenians, Azers and other nationalities inhabiting Azerbaijan. The national government of Iranian Azerbaijan has stated that, recognizing the central Iranian government, it will implement all those measures that do not contradict the autonomy of Iranian Azerbaijan. The government also issued a special appeal to the people, in which it announced that, while maintaining the integrity and independence of Iran, it is beginning to fulfill its duties. The government urged government officials and all citizens to continue to work and declared the inviolability of private property. Then the national government of Iranian Azerbaijan invited the Iranian troops, gendarmerie, and police stationed in Azerbaijan to obey his orders. In Tabriz, Ardabil, Kohi, Murat, Ahar and other places in Azerbaijan, Iranian troops, gendarmerie and police surrendered their weapons, or placed themselves at the disposal of the government of Iranian Azerbaijan. Only in Razaya, a brigade of Iranian troops under the command of Colonel Zengin made a provocative attack on the city, shooting civilians, beating them and mocking them. But after some time, this brigade also submitted to the Azerbaijani government. The government immediately began to implement its program. Laws were adopted on the introduction of the Azerbaijani language as an official language, on amnesty for political prisoners, on the creation of a people's militia, on the prohibition of the use of opium, on the elimination of prostitution, etc. All these laws were immediately implemented. The Majlis of Iranian Azerbaijan adopted a resolution on the free distribution of state lands and waters among peasants, as well as a resolution on the confiscation of all property of those persons who left Azerbaijan and carried out hostile propaganda and activities against democratic Azerbaijan. On the basis of this law, state lands and the lands of those reactionary landowners who fled and waged an active struggle against democratic Azerbaijan were distributed free of charge to the peasants. In total, 257,066 hectares of land were distributed. The land was received by 209,096 peasants. Measures were also taken to limit the exploitation of the peasants and to significantly increase, in the division of the harvest, the share of the peasants working on the lands of those landowners who remained the owners of the land. In April 1946, the Azerbaijani National Majlis adopted a law on the division of the harvest between peasants and landowners. This law proceeded from the fact of the existence of the old five-term formula for the division of the harvest between peasants and landowners. However, the conditions established by law deprived this formula of its former character, a tool for the unrestrained exploitation of the peasants by the landowners. The law forbade the collection by the landlords from the peasants of any other requisitions, except for the share of the harvest established by this law. Thus, all in-kind duties and other requisitions that had previously been collected from the peasants by the landlords were abolished. Further, the law established that all implements of production, draft animals and seeds must belong to the peasant. If the latter did not have them, then the landowner undertook to provide the peasant with them on loan on the terms of an interest-free loan, with the obligation to return during the harvest. If by the end of the year the peasant was unable to pay off the landowner, then the term for paying the debt was extended by the decision of the village committee. A rural committee of 3 to 5 people was to be elected for a period of 1 year to monitor the implementation of this law and organize assistance to the peasants. The law provided that if the landowner was not able to satisfy the needs of the peasants related to the processing of the plot, then they should be provided by government bodies. Article 5 of the law provided that 20% of the crop, previously taken by the landowner under the guise of reimbursement for harvesting expenses even before it was divided, was now transferred to the peasant, who himself had to harvest and thresh. The law specifically stipulated that the share of the landowner should be transported to his barns not by the peasants, but by the landlord himself, and that all the straw from the harvest should belong to the peasant. Further, the law established a differentiated share of the traditional factors of agricultural production. So, on non-irrigated lands, labor power was determined at 3 units, land at 1, seeds at 1, and plowing, that is, draft animals at 2 units. Thus, on non-irrigated lands, the crop had to be divided into 7 parts. Of these, only a 7th part was to go to the landowner, and 6/7 of the total harvest to the peasant. All irrigated lands were divided by law into 2 categories. The first category is irrigated lands irrigated by river or spring water brought to the fields through ground channels. The share of agricultural production factors on these lands was determined by law as follows: labor force was determined at 5 units, plowing draft livestock at 2, land at 1, water at 1, seeds at 1. The harvest on these lands, such thus, it had to be divided into 10 parts, of which 2 should be allocated to the landowner, 8 to the peasant. The second category is irrigated lands irrigated by underground channels, kares, or water extracted from the ground. The harvest from these lands was to be divided according to the following calculation. The labor force was determined in 5 units, plowing, draft cattle in 2, seeds in 1, water in 3, land in 1. Therefore, where the water supplied to the fields by underground channels, and the land belonged to the landowner, he was supposed to receive 4/12 of the harvest, and the peasant 8/12. Repair of channels should be carried out at the expense of their owners. For irrigation of gardens with water extracted from underground or supplied by kares, the law provided for a cash payment of 150 rials from an area of 1 hectare for grazing cattle on state or landlord pastures. The law also provided for a cash payment in the amount of 2 rials for 1 ram, 4 rials for 1 head of cattle, and 6 rials for 1 camel, donkey and horse. Thus, the law of the Azerbaijani National Democratic Government on the division of the harvest between the peasant and the landowner, while maintaining the landowner's ownership of land and water, ensured a significant increase in the share of the peasant and freed him from the landowner's bondage. This law was a serious step towards improving the situation of peasants and changing agrarian relations in Azerbaijan. But the peasant movement in Azerbaijan reached such a wide scale that the peasants were not satisfied with such a decision. They strove for radical change in agrarian relations, for the complete elimination of landlord ownership of land and water, and for the division of land among the peasants. In many regions, contrary to the decisions of the National Democratic Government of Azerbaijan, the peasants completely stopped paying the landowners' share after the harvest. In some areas, they began to divide those landowners' lands, which, according to the decision of the democratic Azerbaijani government, were not subject to division. The victory of the democratic movement in Iranian Azerbaijan led to a significant improvement in the condition of the peasants, and to a serious undermining of the economic and political positions and influence of the reactionary landowners. Along with agrarian reforms, the Azerbaijani democratic government took a number of other measures to boost the economy of Azerbaijan and improve the material situation of the broad masses of the people. This activity of the Azerbaijani Democrats proceeded in the conditions of sabotage and intrigues on the part of local reactionary elements. The reactionary Iranian government, as well as the British and American imperialists, tried in every possible way to undermine the economic situation in Azerbaijan. Trying to artificially cause famine, the reactionaries exported food from Azerbaijan, inflated prices, etc. A branch of the English Shahanshah Bank began to collect banknotes that were in circulation in Azerbaijan. A policy of sabotage was also carried out by branches of Iranian banks. There was a threat of a monetary crisis and serious economic difficulties. The government took swift and decisive measures to eliminate reactionary intrigues and sabotage. It established its control over the activities of the branches of Iranian banks, national, industrial, and agricultural. Measures were also taken to combat speculation. The government organized state trade, state stores were opened. In a small amount, temporary conditional banknotes were issued. The Azerbaijani Democrats also took quick and effective measures to raise the Azerbaijani industry, which, both under Reza Shah and under the subsequent reactionary Iranian governments, not only did not develop, but on the contrary, was deliberately curtailed and destroyed. The Democrats set up existing factories and opened a new carpet and weaving factory and various workshops. The government also promoted the development of handicrafts, encouraged the creation of partnerships and artels, etc. An 8-hour working day was established. Laws on labor and social insurance were adopted. As a result of all these measures, the threat of an economic crisis caused by the sabotage and intrigues of the reactionaries and imperialists was eliminated, and the country's economic condition improved significantly. The financial and political situation of the population of Iranian Azerbaijan has risen immeasurably. Prices for food and essentials have dropped sharply. Prices for basic foodstuffs in Tabriz under the Democrats were on average 2 times lower than in Tehran. In the cities and regions of Iranian Azerbaijan, unprecedented order, tranquility, and security were established. The measures taken by the democratic government in the field of public education and culture were also very successful and fruitful. In an exceptionally short time, education in all schools was translated into the native language of the population. Textbooks for the first 7 grades of the school were prepared and published in Azerbaijani. The construction of large, comfortable buildings for schools began, and numerous new schools were opened. Hundreds of literacy courses were organized in towns and villages, attended by thousands of men, women, children, and the elderly. The State Azerbaijan University was opened in Tabriz. At the expense of the state budget, the government created a musical and drama theater, an art school, a national orchestra, and a choir in Tabriz. Newspapers, books, magazines were published in Azerbaijani. A new hospital was built in Tabriz, free medical care was provided to the population, state shelters were opened for orphans and the elderly. Azerbaijani Democrats paid great attention to the improvement of cities and the repair of roads. All the central streets of the city of Tabriz were covered with asphalt. Similar events were held in Urmia, Ardabil, Zanjan, Murat and other cities of Iranian Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani Democrats have done a great job of liquidating the old, reactionary, rotten state apparatus. The population was spared the arbitrariness and violence of the police and gendarmerie. With bribery, embezzlement and other vices, which are common and widespread phenomena in the reactionary Iranian state apparatus, the most resolute and merciless struggle was waged. A new state apparatus was created from people devoted to the people and working for its interests. The population of Iranian Azerbaijan provided all kinds of support to the Azerbaijani national government in its policy. The American and British imperialists, as well as the Iranian reactionaries, primarily the Sayyids, waged a furious provocative and slanderous campaign against the Azerbaijani national government, accusing it of separatism, of intending to secede from Iran. The chief of the general staff, General Arfa, and the Sayyids sent armed bands of disguised provocateurs and saboteurs to Azerbaijan. Attempts were also made to raise Shahsevans and other tribes living in Iranian Azerbaijan, and even South Iranian nomads, against the democratic government of Azerbaijan. But these provocations were not successful. Azerbaijani tribes refused to oppose the democratic order established in Azerbaijan. Only in the area of Zanjan did the reactionaries manage to organize an armed gang headed by the great Zanjan feudal lord Zulfagari. Despite the fact that this gang was supported in every possible way by the general staff and was supplied with weapons, its actions were also not successful. The southern Iranian tribes did not respond to the calls of the reaction and did not oppose democratic Azerbaijan at that time. On the contrary, an uprising began in Bakhtiaria, caused by the arbitrariness of the ruler, the reactionary Mortazakuli Khan Samsam of Bakhtia, closely associated with the British. As a result of the uprising of Mortazakuli Khan, was forced to flee from Bakhtiaria. Broad sections of the population of the northern, central and southern provinces of Iran not only did not respond to the provocative calls of the Sayyids and other reactionaries to oppose Azerbaijan, but, on the contrary, welcomed the development of the democratic movement in Azerbaijan and followed its progress with exceptional sympathy. Considering the events in Azerbaijan as the beginning of the renewal and democratization of Iran as a whole. Moreover, the success of the democratic movement in Azerbaijan served as a powerful impetus to the development of the democratic movement in other provinces of Iran. At the end of 1945, the Democratic Party of Kurdistan was formed in northern Kurdistan, Mehabad. It included progressive-minded leaders of the Kurdish tribes, landowners, merchants, representatives of the local intelligentsia, and the clergy. The leader of the Democratic Party of Kurdistan was the clergyman and Kurdish leader Qazi Mohammed, who enjoyed great authority among the Kurds. The main goal of the Democratic Kurds was the formation of a free autonomous democratic Kurdistan within Iran. At the first Congress of the Democratic Party of Kurdistan, held in Mashhad on October 25 to 28, 1945, a declaration was adopted in which the following main requirements were proclaimed. Granting Kurds autonomy within Iran to manage their local affairs, teaching children in schools in their native Kurdish language, and keeping records in the same language. The creation of a regional Enjumen of Kurdistan to supervise and control all local affairs, the appointment of government officials from local residents. The declaration spoke of the need to regulate relations between peasants and landowners, as well as the establishment of unity and brotherhood between Azerbaijanis and other peoples inhabiting Azerbaijan, Izars, Armenians, etc. The declaration proclaimed that the Kurdistan Democratic Party would strive to improve the situation of the Kurdish people through the use of the natural resources of Kurdistan, the development of agriculture, and the expansion of the network of public education and health institutions. Following the establishment of a democratic regime in Azerbaijan, Kurdish Democrats took power into their own hands in northern Kurdistan. In Mashhad, an autonomous government of democratic Kurds was formed, headed by Qazi Mohammed. The entire local administration was staffed by Kurds. Armed Kurdish detachments were formed to protect democratic Kurdistan. Democratic Kurds began organizing schools and publishing newspapers in Kurdish. Unlike Azerbaijan, in Kurdistan, reforms in the field of agrarian relations were not launched, which remained without significant changes. Relations of friendly cooperation were established between democratic Azerbaijan and Kurdish Democrats. Following Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, the democratic movement began to develop widely in other areas of Iran. The authority and influence of the People's Party and trade unions have increased. The peasant movement developed widely both in the north and in the south. Tens and hundreds of thousands of peasants joined peasant unions led by the People's Party. Mass peasant unions were organized in Gilan, Mazandaran, Khorasan, as well as in the regions of Yezd, Isfahan, Kerman, Fars, Khuzestan and other regions of Iran. The main demands of the peasants were a revision of the procedure for dividing the crop, an increase in the peasants' share at the expense of the landowners' share, and the abolition of natural duties, the so-called avries. In Gilan, Kerman, Isfahan, Fars and many other regions, the peasants without permission stopped performing natural duties, and even paying the landlord's share of the crop. Frightened by the unprecedentedly wide scope of the peasant movement, the landowners, in negotiations with representatives of the People's Party and the peasant unions, agreed to increase the peasants' share in the division of the harvest. They did this so as not to lose their entire share, and to ensure that they receive at least part of it. In Gilan, in the regions of Isfahan, Yezd, Kerman and in other regions, in the spring of 1946, agreements were concluded between representatives of the landlords and peasants to increase the peasants' share of the harvest. Thus, at the end of 1945, and at the beginning of 1946 in Iran, under the influence of the victory of the Democrats in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, the democratic movement was widely developed. Under these conditions, by the beginning of 1946 it became clear to the reactionary circles in power, at that time, that they did not have enough ground inside Iran to fight against democratic Azerbaijan and the democratic movement in Iran as a whole. Therefore, the bankrupt reactionary circles decided to seek outside help, turning the inter-Iranian Azerbaijani issue into an international one. Encouraged by representatives of foreign powers, the Hakimi government in January 1946, without any grounds for this, raised the question of Soviet interference in the internal affairs of Iran at the United Nations. The Hakimi government followed the lead of the Anglo-American imperialists, who needed to raise the Iranian question in order to divert the attention of the world community from the events in Greece and Indonesia, where the British intervention was completely open and undisguised. But the calculations of the Iranian reaction did not materialize. The attempt to use the United Nations to strengthen the positions of the Iranian reactionaries failed. Having suffered a complete failure in its reactionary domestic and anti-Soviet foreign policy, the Hakimi government was forced to resign. In January 1946, Ahmed Kavam Sultan, was appointed as the new prime minister. A large Gilan landowner, the owner of huge tea plantations near the city of Lahijan, Kavam was known for his reactionary views, as well as old connections with the American imperialists. At the same time, in an effort to mislead the country's public opinion and get into power, Kavam then advocated fundamental changes in Iran's foreign and domestic policy for the establishment of normal relations with the USSR, etc. In the conditions created in early 1946 in the country, it was impossible to continue an open reactionary domestic and anti-Soviet foreign policy. This forced Kavam to resort to maneuvers, temporarily abandon the open persecution of democratic organizations, as well as the foreign policy openly hostile to the Soviet Union. The Kavam government lifted some restrictions on the activities of democratic organizations in the country. The clubs of the People's Party and trade unions, previously occupied by soldiers and police, were liberated. The ban was lifted from some democratic newspapers, meetings and rallies were allowed. Then some reactionaries were removed from their posts, the chief of the general staff, General Arthur, the military governor of Tehran, and others. On March 20, 1946, Sayyid Zia was arrested, and then some other reactionary leaders Dashti, Tahiri, Imami. On February 18, Kavam left for Moscow at the head of an Iranian delegation for negotiations with the Soviet government. On April 6, a communiqué was published on the Soviet-Iranian negotiations, which were started in Moscow and then continued and completed on April 4, 1946, with the signing of an agreement in Tehran. As a result of these negotiations, the parties reached an agreement on the creation of a mixed Soviet-Iranian society for the exploration and exploitation of oil fields in northern Iran. The term of the society's activity was determined to be 50 years. During the first 25 years of the company's operation, 49% of the shares must be owned by the Iranian side and 51% by the Soviet side. Over the next 25 years, both parties must own 50% of the shares. The profit of the company shall be divided according to the shares of each party. The capital of the Soviet side should consist of various kinds of expenses, equipment and wages for specialists and workers that will be necessary for the exploration, production and processing of oil. The capital of the Iranian side should consist only of oil-bearing lands. The protection of those areas where reconnaissance work will be carried out. The protection of oil developments and all enterprises of the society should be carried out exclusively by the security agencies of Iran. The agreement provided that the agreement on the creation of a mixed Soviet-Iranian oil society and its terms would be submitted for approval by the new Majlis of the 15th convocation before the expiration of a 7-month period, counting from March 24, 1946. The conditions for organizing the Soviet-Iranian Oil Society provided for this form of cooperation between Iran and USSR, which was based on respect for the political and economic independence of Iran and fully and completely consistent with the interests of the development of the Iranian economy. The benefits of these conditions for Iran were especially clearly revealed when compared with the terms of the concession of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which are based on the inequality of the parties, on the provision of such privileges and advantages to the British, which contradict the principle of Iranian state sovereignty. Turn the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company into a state-in-state, and enable the British to carry out the predatory plunder of the national wealth of Iran and the exploitation of the Iranian people. The implementation of the Soviet-Iranian Agreement of April 4, 1946, would be an important step towards improving Soviet-Iranian relations and developing the Iranian economy. The Kavam government also began negotiations with the leaders of democratic Azerbaijan, which ended on June 13, 1946, with the signing of an agreement. This agreement provided for the creation of an administrative council for the administration of the province, consisting of the Governor-General, the heads of provincial institutions, and the Presidium of the Provincial Enjuman. The Iranian government agreed to recognize the National Majlis of Azerbaijan elected at the end of 1945, as an Azerbaijani provincial enjumen before the adoption of a new law on provincial and regional enjumen. The Governor-General was to be appointed by the provincial enjumen and approved by the Iranian government. The Administrative Council shall perform its duties under the supervision of the provincial enjumen. An agreement was reached on the transformation of the Fidai volunteer detachments into a gendarmerie, and that the local Azerbaijani military units created during the democratic movement by conscripting those liable for military service would be merged into the all-Iranian army. Regarding finances, the Iranian government agreed that 75% of Azerbaijan's income would be spent on local needs, and 25% would be transferred to the Center for National Needs. In addition, the government recognized the distribution of state lands carried out in Azerbaijan. With regard to other lands divided among the peasants during the democratic movement, an agreement was reached on the creation of a commission of representatives of the government and the provincial enjumen to work out the question of the procedure for compensating the damage caused to the landowners, or replacing their land holdings with others. The Iranian government also undertook, after the opening of the 15th Majlis, to submit to the Majlis a draft of a new electoral law based on democratic principles. The agreement provided that in Azerbaijan, teaching in secondary and higher schools would be conducted in two languages, Persian and Azerbaijani. The government also agreed to give Kurds, Artsas, Armenians and other national minorities the right to educate children up to the 5th grade of primary school in their native language. An Azerbaijani, who held the post of Minister of Internal Affairs in the national government of Azerbaijan, was appointed Governor-General of Azerbaijan. In most cases, former ministers of the Azerbaijani government were appointed heads of provincial institutions. The implementation of this agreement and the promises of the Iranian government would be a major victory for the democratic forces of Iran and a serious step towards the democratization of the country. The government also published a declaration on the division of state lands among the peasants and on the increase in the share of the peasant by 15% at the expense of the landowner's share in the distribution of crops throughout Iran. In his repeated statements on the radio, Prime Minister Kavam spoke out against the reactionaries, the opponents of Iranian progress, and the agents of foreigners, and promised to carry out democratic progressive reforms, end the anti-Soviet foreign policy of previous cabinets, and pursue a foreign policy based on the principle of balance. Some part of the democratic public in Iran hoped that the Iranian reaction would be seriously defeated, that the government of Kavam would actually carry out the progressive reforms that it announced in its declarations, and put an end to the anti-Soviet foreign policy pursued until then by the reactionary Iranian cabinets at the behest of the British American imperialists. Therefore, the Iranian People's Party, trade unions and other democratic organizations supported the Kavam government. However, subsequent events showed that the hopes of the democratic public in Iran were not justified. With the help of their foreign patrons, the Anglo-American imperialists, the temporarily subdued Iranian reaction was secretly preparing for a new offensive against the forces of Iranian democracy. The imperialists, especially the British and American oil monopolies, used every possible means to mobilize the reactionary forces in Iran, use them to stifle the forces of Iranian democracy, and restore the power and influence of the old bankrupt reactionary political groups. The British imperialists, in particular the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, played a very important role in all these intrigues and intrigues against Iranian democracy. British residents, employees of the political service of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, created the so-called Union of the Tribes of Khuzestan, which put forward a demand for the separation of Khuzestan from Iran and its annexation to Iraq. The same kind of activity was carried out among the tribes in the south of Iran in Fars. The British supplied the reactionary Khans and their gangs with weapons, and British agents provoked various kinds of clashes with democratic organizations in Tehran and elsewhere. in order to intimidate the democratic elements and cheer up the Iranian reaction both in Kurdistan and in Iran as a whole. The British sent warships in July 1946 to the Persian Gulf and to the ports of Azerbaijan and Khorramshahr. In early August, several British divisions were sent to Basra, which came close to the Iranian borders. The American imperialists, who attach great importance to Iran in their adventurous plans to establish world domination and fight against the democratic camp, have especially intensified their provocative activities. In June 1946, the American ambassador to Iran, Allen, publicly defended reactionary Iranian newspapers and figures. Allen then made openly anti-Soviet, provocative, and deceitful statements about the Soviet Union. Official American representatives openly pushed the Iranian reaction to fight against the democratic forces and to take anti-Soviet actions. The provocations and incitements of the British and American imperialists did not remain fruitless. The Iranian reactionaries gradually began to raise their heads again. Kazem Sultan, long known for his reactionary nature, and also for his connections, first with the British and then especially with the American imperialists, essentially pursued a policy of deceiving Iranian democracy, a policy of fighting against democratic forces, a policy of restoring the positions of reactionary groupings in Iran. As early as April 1946, attacks by reactionary bands on the premises of democratic organizations and on democratic leaders resumed. Characteristically, these raids resumed first in Lahijan and in other regions of Gilan, where the vast land holdings of Kazem are located. Then they spread to Isfahan, Mazandaran and Gorgan. The gendarmerie and the police not only did not stop the hooligan actions of the reactionary bands, but helped them. Although numerous robber gangs were in charge in the south of Iran, and the presence of gendarmerie units there was essential to ensure the safety of the population. About two-thirds of all gendarmes located in the south were transferred to the north, mainly to the industrial centers of northern Iran. On June 23, 1946, Kazem published a declaration directed against the workers' organizations, in which he accused them of violating public order and unlawfully interfering in the affairs of the executive branch. Referring to the activities of the workers' organizations, Kazem declared that he would not allow anarchy, unrest to reign in the country under the guise of democracy. This declaration served as a signal to intensify the struggle against democratic organizations. A wave of anti-democratic provocative speeches spread to Semnan, Kerman, and other regions. On June 29, Kazem announced in a radio speech that he had formed the so-called Democratic Party of Iran. In the simultaneously published program of this party, it was announced that its goal was allegedly to ensure the independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Iran, improve the situation of peasants and workers, carry out fundamental reforms in the field of healthcare, public education, the judiciary and tax system, develop industry, revise laws based on democratic principles. The Democratic Party was joined mainly by people who hoped to use the party led by the Prime Minister, that is, the government party, for their own personal, selfish, careeristic purposes. It included prominent government officials, landowners, and merchants. Many Sayyids, members of the reactionary Adalat Party and other reactionary groupings, who were especially willing to become members of the Democratic Party, as a rule, played a leading role in the creation of its local and central organizations. The Democratic Party also included some renegades, former participants in the democratic movement, hoping in this way to secure profitable positions for themselves. Kazem himself, setting an example for his henchmen, used the position of Prime Minister for personal enrichment. He took huge bribes when issuing licenses for the export and import of goods. After Kazem's resignation from the post of Prime Minister, in April 1948, materials were handed over to the Majlis on charges of taking bribes in the amount of 4 million rials for issuing licenses for the export of 14,000 tons of barley and 12,000 tons of rice, and 8.5 million rials for licenses to import 400 tons of tea. The Democratic Party became the center around which the forces of Iranian reaction were grouped. Immediately after the formation of the Democratic Party, its local organizations, on instructions from above, began to fight against the People's Party, trade unions, peasant unions and other democratic organizations. As early as July 1946, the Democratic Party began to organize attacks on the activists of the People's Party, trade unions and peasant unions, and pogroms of committees of these organizations in the field. At first, these attacks and pogroms were carried out in districts and small towns, then they spread to larger cities and regional centers. In carrying out these provocations against democratic organizations, the gendarmerie, the police and, in general, the entire state apparatus, which was placed at the service of the Democratic Party in its struggle against truly democratic forces, were widely used. The authorities declared martial law where the attack on the democratic forces began, thus facilitating the reprisals against democratic leaders. The arrests and expulsion of leaders and active participants in the democratic movement. On July 14, 1946, a general strike of workers and employees broke out at the enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Kurdistan in protest against the intervention of the British Oil Company in the internal political life of Iran. The strike was unusually unanimous. All the workers and employees of the company were on strike: Persians, Azerbaijanis, Arabs, Indians and workers of other nationalities, about 100,000 people in total. The strikers demanded an end to the intervention of the British company in the political life of Iran, the liquidation of the political service of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and the expulsion of the leaders of this service from Iran. The transformation of the company into a purely commercial enterprise, as well as the removal of Mesbah Fatemi, an open agent of the company, from the post of Governor-General of Kurdistan. In addition, the workers made a number of economic demands. The British, with the help of their agents, the chief of the Azerbaijan police, Colonel Lowley, and the military governor of Azerbaijan, Major Fatih, who received a bribe of 200,000 rials from the British company, and some sheikhs of the Arab tribes, provoked an armed attack by the Arabs on the workers in Azerbaijan on the very first day of the strike. As a result, 46 were killed and 170 wounded. As the Iranian authorities themselves were later forced to admit, the shooting at the workers was opened with the aim of provoking riots. The Iranian government declared the strike illegal. Martial law was declared in Kurdistan. All the leaders of the Kurdistan trade unions were arrested, and the trade union premises were occupied by troops. Machine guns were installed in Azerbaijan. Soldiers fired at the workers. The government, frightened by the wide scope of the strike, promised to consider the demands of the workers, but after the strike was called off, broke their promise. The British, in particular the administration of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, were given complete freedom of activity in Kurdistan. Fear of a further growth of the labor movement in the enterprises of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, along with the desire to cheer up the Iranian reaction, was the reason for the above-mentioned sending of British warships to the Persian Gulf in late July 1946, and the landing in early August of several divisions in Basra, near Azerbaijan. In opposition to the democratic trade unions, the Qawam government and the Democratic Party began to organize their own yellow trade unions. Then the Democratic Party began to create from the criminal elements the so-called National Salvation Detachments. These detachments of the fascist type had a special form, and were used to attack workers and other participants in the democratic movement. But, despite the pressure and threats from the authorities, the police and the gendarmerie, the workers refused to join the Democratic Party and its fake trade unions. Qawam's declarations on reforms, on improving the condition of the peasants and workers, were published with the aim of misleading the democratic public and gaining the time needed to consolidate the reactionary forces and crush the democratic organizations in the localities. For the same purpose, on August 1, 1946, Qawam reorganized the cabinet, including 3 members of the People's Party: Iraj Iskandari, Dr. Keshavaz and Dr. Yazdi as ministers of industry and trade, education and health. This was done in order to tie the hands of the People's Party and force it to share responsibility for the anti-democratic actions of the authorities. Under the new cabinet, the persecution of democratic organizations, including the People's Party, intensified even more. On August 29, 1946, soldiers and police destroyed the club of the Regional Committee of the People's Party in Shiraz. Armed gangs of reactionaries became active again in Mazandaran, in the regions of Shalas and Shaki. The defeat of the committees of the People's Party also took place in the regions of Yazd, Isfahan, Kermanshah, and others. Provocations of gendarmes began against democratic Azerbaijan and in the regions adjacent to it. In order to deceive public opinion and create the illusion that Kavam and his entourage were fighting against the reaction and agents of the imperialists. For the national independence and sovereignty of Iran, in early September 1946, the government, together with foreign representatives, staged the so-called disclosure of the Isfahan plot. The reactionary Bakhshir Khan Mortazakuli Samsam, his sons and some other reactionaries known for their ties with the British were arrested on charges of plotting against the government and intending to carry out a reactionary coup in Isfahan. After some time, they were all released for lack of evidence. Martial law declared in Isfahan under the pretext of fighting a reactionary conspiracy was used to intensify repression against democratic organizations and to create a local organization of a democratic party under the protection of bayonets. Having strengthened their positions, the reaction went over to an open offensive against all democratic forces, including against democratic Azerbaijan. In mid-September, the Kashkai and other southern Iranian Khans, instigated by the British and American imperialists, as well as the Tehran reactionaries, came out. Armed detachments of the Kashkai, Boyuamadi, and Mamasoni tribes, disarming the gendarmerie posts and garrisons, occupied Kazran, Bushehr and other cities of Fars and approached the provincial center, the city of Shiraz. Everywhere, the Khan's bands cracked down on members of the People's Party and other participants in the democratic movement. In Kazran, in the Bayza region, northwest of Shiraz, and elsewhere, nomads robbed and killed civilians. They openly opposed democratic Azerbaijan and demanded the removal of members of the People's Party from the government. They also provocatively demanded that the population of Fars, which meant primarily nomadic tribes, be given autonomy. Having a regular army with tanks and planes, the government could easily put an end to the rebellion of the South Iranian Khans. The representatives of the government and the military authorities verbally opposed this rebellion, calling it reactionary and treacherous, but in reality nothing was done to suppress it. The troops sent to Fars were delayed for many days on the way. General Zahidi, close to the Kashkai Khans, was appointed commander of the troops in Fars, who during the war was arrested for pro-fascist activities jointly with the Kashkai Khans. The pilots of the Iranian army, who flew over the detachments of the tribes, were forbidden to shoot live ammunition and drop bombs, which were even taken from them before the flight. The officers, parts of which resisted the tribes, were then put on trial, while the leaders of the rebellion were received with honor by the government in Tehran. This rebellion was inspired not only by the foreign imperialists, but also by Kavam himself, who needed a new pretext for crushing the democratic organizations and for postponing the elections to the Majlis. This speech was a political maneuver aimed at untying the hands of Kavam to fight against democratic Azerbaijan and other democratic forces. In mid-October 1946, an agreement was published between the Iranian government and the South Iranian Khans, declaring the Reactionary Rebellion in Fars a national movement. The main principles of which were supposedly patriotism, defense of the independence, and territorial integrity of Iran. At the same time, Kavam reorganized his cabinet, removing from it ministers who were members of the People's Party. Negotiations were interrupted between the Iranian government and the Azerbaijani delegation, which left Tehran. At the end of October, the reactionary Tehran newspapers began a provocative slanderous campaign against Azerbaijan, demanding that troops be sent there. The Democratic Party, the gendarmerie and the police have further intensified their pogrom activities against the People's Party, trade unions, and other democratic organizations. The reactionary newspapers also resumed slanderous attacks in the Sayed spirit against the Soviet Union. General Arfa and many other reactionaries, who were arrested in the spring of 1946 were. On November 21, Kavam's circular was published stating that in order to ensure freedom of elections in the future, the 15th Majlis for each polling station in all provinces, including Azerbaijan, gendarmes and troops will be sent in sufficient numbers. Inciting Kavam to anti-democratic actions, the American ambassador to Iran, Allen, declared at the end of November 1946 that the decision of the Iranian government to send troops to all points of the country to ensure calm during the elections to the Majlis is a completely normal and appropriate thing. On December 10, 1946, Iranian troops were moved to Azerbaijan by order of Kavam. After the entry of troops in all regions of Azerbaijan, martial law was declared and wild reprisals began against the leaders of the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan and all participants in the democratic movement. The gangs of reactionaries were given complete freedom. Bandits caught Azerbaijani Democrats on the streets, shot them and robbed their property. According to the information published by the Mardom newspaper on July 5, 1947, 760 people were shot and hanged in Azerbaijan in a few months. Several thousand people were killed by gendarmes and reactionaries as a result of unauthorized reprisals. All progressive reforms and activities carried out by Azerbaijani Democrats were declared invalid. Ali Mansur, who served as Prime Minister under Reza Shah, was appointed Governor-General of Azerbaijan. The reactionary officials and landowners, who fled from Azerbaijan during the democratic movement, returned there again and began to carry out reprisals against the population. The reprisals against the participants in the democratic movement in Azerbaijan surpassed all the horrors of the regime of Reza Shah in cruelty and ferocity. Following Azerbaijan, the troops were moved to Kurdistan, where a ferocious massacre was also carried out against the leaders of the Kurdish democratic movement. Kurdish leaders, including Qazi Mohammed and his brother Qazi Sadr, were hanged. Simultaneously with the attack on Azerbaijan, newspapers of the People's Party and trade unions were closed in Tehran. In Tehran, Kazvin, Gorgan, Bandar Shah and other cities, gangs of the Democratic Party, gendarmes and police defeated the committees of the People's Party and trade unions. About 500 workers were arrested in the center of the textile industry, the city of Sharki, Mazandaran, and over 400 workers in Tehran and its environs. Mass arrests were also made in other cities and regions. In response to an appeal from the Central Council of Iranian Trade Unions, the World Trade Union Federation decided to send a delegation to Iran to familiarize themselves with the situation in Iran on the spot. Hoping to somehow justify the unprecedented terror against the democratic movement before the world community, the Iranian authorities fabricated the case of the so-called Mazandaran conspiracy. Without any grounds for this, they attributed to the leaders of the People's Party and trade unions the organization of a conspiracy in Mazandaran and the intention to separate Mazandaran from Iran. With terrible beatings and medieval torture, the workers were forced to sign interrogation protocols prepared in advance by the authorities. On February 13, 1947, a gang of hooligans, bribed by the Democratic Party and the authorities, broke down the doors and seized the premises of the Central Council of Iranian Trade Unions in Tehran. Then the election of a new Council of Trade Unions was staged. The raid was carried out under the protection of the police and gendarmerie. This provocation was organized to prove to the delegation of the World Federation of Trade Unions that the members of the trade unions supposedly changed their leadership. In every possible way, the authorities tried to mislead the delegation of the World Federation, which arrived in Tehran at the end of February 1947. and instill in it the idea that the leadership of the Free Democratic Iranian trade unions was allegedly not supported by the workers. Immediately upon arrival in Tehran, members of the delegation were declared guests of the Iranian government. Surrounded by officials of the Ministry of Labor and Propaganda and representatives of yellow trade unions, and taken to the Derbent Hotel, 18 kilometers from Tehran, away from the workers. During the visit of the delegation to the industrial centers of Iran, the authorities also took measures to prevent workers from communicating with the delegation of the World Federation. However, all these tricks were not successful. After the delegation traveled to Iran and got acquainted with the situation on the ground, the chairman of the delegation, Al-Ariz, stated that the World Federation of Trade Unions continues to recognize the Central Council of Iranian Trade Unions as the only organization representing workers, and that the vast majority of Iranian workers support the Central Council of Iranian Trade Unions. Convinced that it would not be possible to mislead the delegation, on April 13, 1947, the authorities arrested the secretary of the Central Council of Iranian Trade Unions, Reza Rust, on trumped-up charges. Other leading officials of the Central Council were also arrested. At the same time, Said Zia was released from custody by order of Kavam. Under such conditions of rampant reaction and Black Hundred terror, in the first half of 1947, elections were held for the 15th Majlis. In Gorgan, Babel and other cities and districts, candidates for deputies of the Majlis, nominated by the People's Party and the trade unions, were arrested, and from Semnan, Khuzestan and Kerman were deported. Lists of candidates for deputies were compiled by the Democratic Party and the authorities. Even before the start of the elections, newspapers published the names of those who would be elected from one or another district. In the voting, brute pressure, all sorts of fraudulent machinations and forgeries were used everywhere in droves. Dismissals and arrests of workers, as well as deductions from wages for refusing to vote for government candidates. Forgery of passports and voting on other people's passports and on the passports of the dead, voting on the same passport 2 to 3 times or more were common. Passports were confiscated from workers and employees during the elections, which were then used by figureheads, who were brought by the authorities to the polling stations in cars, to vote. In many cases, these voters were transported hundreds of kilometers from one constituency to another. A complaint filed in February 1947 with the Tehran Electoral Commission about election abuses in Tehran reported that in a number of polling stations in Tehran the number of ballots cast was 10 times the number of actual voters. Forgery was widely used in the counting of votes. The People's Party and the Democratic Trade Unions refused to take part in the elections due to the lack of the most elementary democratic freedoms. A small number of voters took part in the elections. Even according to official, exaggerated data, in Tehran, out of a total of about 800,000 residents and about 200,000 voters, only 78,000 people took part in the voting. By the middle of 1947, the elections to the 15th Majlis were basically over. Tough reactionaries, closely associated with the Americans and the British, were elected to the Majlis. According to the Iranian press, among the 122 deputies elected to the Majlis of the 15th convocation, there were 62 large landowners, 10 manufacturers and breeders, 22 senior officials and 28 lawyers, journalists and so-called local influential people. At the same time, more than half of the deputies, senior officials and lawyers were members of the boards or shareholders of various commercial and industrial companies and societies. Thus, the 15th Majlis was entirely landowner bourgeois in its social composition. Not a single representative of democratic organizations was elected to the new Majlis, while even in the 14th Majlis there was a group of democratically inclined deputies. 8 deputies of the People's Party and others. 14th Majlis. The meetings of the 15th Majlis opened on July 17, 1947. The course of the Kavam government in the field of domestic policy became more and more reactionary. Kavam increasingly became a tool of the American imperialists. This also affected the foreign policy line of the Kavam government and its relations with the Soviet Union. As under the governments of Syed, Sadr and Hakimi, the reactionary newspapers published anti-Soviet articles systematically and with impunity. In a number of cases, for example, on issues of Soviet-Iranian trade, the Soviet airline in Iran, the anti-Soviet speeches of the reactionary press were clearly inspired by government circles, which acted on the orders of the American imperialists, who sought to undermine Soviet-Iranian relations. Kavam began to openly depart from the Soviet-Iranian agreement signed by him on April 4, 1946 on oil issues. On June 14, 1947, in the French newspaper Le Monde, an interview was published by a representative of this newspaper with Kavam, who stated that the conditions that existed at the time of signing this agreement had changed, that the agreement reached could be rejected by the Majlis, whose deputies had supposedly free views, and that therefore, even before the opening of the Majlis, it is necessary to begin negotiations on this issue, and taking into account the conditions now existing, to prepare such proposals that would be acceptable to public opinion and the Majlis. Having made such a statement, Kavam essentially proposed a revision of the Soviet-Iranian Party and left-wing workers' organizations. Secondly, he would ensure that the majority in the new 15th Majlis belonged to persons enjoying the confidence of the United States, and thirdly, he would spend the loan-on agreement with the American mission, which should be sent to Iran. At the same time, the Kavam government did everything possible to strengthen the position of the US imperialists in Iran. After the end of the Second World War, and especially from the middle of 1946, the US expansionist policy in Iran intensified to an even greater extent. Attempts were renewed to impose an American loan on Iran. The reactionary Iranian rulers, who sought to use American dollars in the fight against Iranian democracy, were quick to express their readiness to fulfill the claims of the American imperialists. The Kavam government turned to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the actual owners of which were the United States, with a request to provide him with a loan in the amount of $250 million. Provided that the Iranian government, firstly, finally put an end to the People's Republic. In January 1947, in agreement with the Iranian government, 11 American specialists arrived in Iran to consider plans for the development of the Iranian economy drawn up by the Iranian government. For 3 months, the Americans considered these plans and left for the United States in May to report them there and then send their conclusion to Iran. Thus, the Kavam government showed its readiness to receive a large American loan at the cost of violating Iranian sovereignty, bringing the Iranian economy under American control, and finally crushing the democratic organizations in the country. Naturally, such terms of the loan and the position of the Iranian government caused indignation, not only of the democratic press, but also of many right-wing Iranian newspapers. Thus, one of the right-wing newspapers, Iran No, wrote that the issue of an American loan imposed on Iran is not only important, but also fatal for Iran, and that receiving this loan is tantamount to the loss of Iran's independence. In June 1947, Tehran newspapers reported that the Americans were trying to get a concession from the Iranian government to establish an American bank in Iran. American capital also penetrated Iran in the form of participation in Iranian societies. For example, as the newspaper Mardom reported on May 22, 1947, in the so-called Iranian Aviation Society, created in 1946, already at the time of its foundation, the Americans had more shares than the Iranians. The aircraft, pilots and technical personnel used by the society were also American. The colonial nature of the US policy was very clearly manifested in the structure of American imports to Iran, using the Iran-US Trade Treaty of 1943. And the rise of US political influence in Iran, the Americans have systematically increased their trade with Iran in recent years. At the same time, exports from the United States to Iran began to exceed imports from Iran by several times. Thus, in a year, from March 21, 1945, To March 20, 1946, goods worth 847 million rials were imported from the United States to Iran, and only 302 million rials from Iran to the United States. Among the goods imported from the United States to Iran in recent years, along with military equipment and uniforms, in the first place are old, worn clothes, knickknacks made of nylon, chewing gum and similar, finished products. The main items of American export from Iran were high-value Iranian carpets and agricultural raw materials. Thus, the American imperialists turned Iran into their agricultural and raw materials appendage and market for industrial products. At the same time, first of all, they sold unnecessary trash to Iran. After the end of the war, the activities of the American military mission in Iran became very active, although earlier, it was repeatedly announced that it would be in the country only during the war. At the beginning of 1947, the term of the agreement with American military advisors in the Iranian army was extended until March 21, 1949, and then it was extended for a further time. The head of the American military mission in Iran, General Grew, developed a plan for the reorganization of the Iranian army, which was approved by the Shah and became the basis for the reorganization of the armed forces of Iran. At the Iranian General Staff, a commission was created with the participation of American advisors, which was engaged in rewriting the regulations of the Iranian army according to American models. Under the guidance of American advisors, the Iranian army began to be re-equipped with American weapons, of the same type as those that the Americans supply to Turkey. In June 1947, contrary to the Iranian constitution, without the knowledge and sanction of the Majlis, an Iranian-American agreement was signed in Washington on providing a $25 million loan to Iran for the purchase of weapons and military materials. American military advisors have also developed a plan to reorganize the Iranian military industry, which includes the refurbishment of Iranian military factories based on American military equipment, so that these factories can produce and repair American weapons. The Americans sought to turn Iran into a U.S. military strategic base. They built airfields in northern Iran, in Rasht and Babolsa. In the city of Qom, at the request of American advisors and under their leadership, a large airfield equipped with American equipment was built, which, judging by its size, is intended for use by non-Iranian aviation. In the south of Iran, the Americans were building underground gas storage facilities. The so-called 7-year plan for the development of the Iranian economy, developed with the active participation of the Americans, provided for the construction of ports in the Persian Gulf, airfields and railways in the amount of 5 billion rials, while only 3 billion rials for industry and exploitation of the subsoil. In May 1947, 3 American warships arrived in the Persian Gulf to familiarize themselves with the ports of Iran and Iraq, one of which entered the Iranian port of Azerbaijan. Arriving on this ship, the commander of the American naval forces in the eastern part of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, Admiral Cannoli, accompanied by senior American officers, traveled to Tehran, where he was received by Prime Minister Kavam and the Minister of War. Subsequently, it became known that in a conversation with the Iranian Minister of War, American officers raised the question of the need to create an Iranian navy in the Caspian Sea. On October 6, 1947, a new agreement was concluded between the governments of the United States and Iran on the activities of the American military mission in Iran, which further strengthened the control of American military advisors over the Iranian army. The new agreement gave the American military mission an even more important role in the activities of the War Department, the Iranian General Staff and their departments.